I hear you.
Yes, we
Okay,
hear
good.
you.
All right. Got a big crowd tonight, Shmuel. The women outnumber the men. Okay. Shmuel, should I wait or not? Okay, I'll take that as a no. Okay, onward. We're going to start learning Bava Metzia. Okay, I wanted to highlight a couple of topics that appear in the first chapter of Bava Metzia. Because what Bava Metzia is really about, and if you've been doing the daf the last few days, you would see that a lot of this has to do with how we deal with sfekos, which are basically doubts, right? We have something that's contested. So the way we deal with doubts, like the Mishnah opens up by saying, we have a doubt in front of us, right? We have two people coming in to a court, and they each claim that they are the proud owners of this talis in the Mishnah, or of anything really. So the question is, how do we, as the court, decide who's the rightful owner? So just learning the Mishnah says, well, the fair and equitable solution is that we split it. So if you look in the Gemara on Daf Beis, Amud Beis, wants to know who does this Mishnah hold like? Meaning, who is the author of this Mishnah that would say that when we have a doubt of how to proceed with a certain case, the best way to do it is 50-50. So toward the end of the Gemara on Daf Beis Amud Beis, the Gemara says, let me just find it. Lema masdisin de lo kesumkos. Let's say that our Mishnah does not follow the opinion of Sumchus. Because Sumchus, the Tana, is of the opinion that anytime there's a doubt as to how we deal with a monetary case where two claimants each have opposing views, Sumchus says to split it down the middle with neither side taking an oath. Our Mishnah, though, says that they split it down the middle, but they each take an oath. They each take a shvua. Okay, so that's what the Gemara says. So in order to fully understand this and where Sumchus comes from, we need to know a little bit of background. Okay, I like to stress that knowing the source is very important. So let's look at a different Gemara, and that could give us a little bit of an idea of who Sumchus is and why he says what he says. So there is a Gemara in Eruvin, Daf Yud Gimel, that says regarding the Tana Rav Meir. Now, why are we talking about Rav Meir? Because we're going to see in a minute that Rav Meir's star pupil was someone by the name of Sumchus. Okay, so Rav Meir, the Gemara says, was the most brilliant of his generation. He was so smart. The problem is that it was to his detriment. Because the Gemara says, and I'm quoting from Daf Yud Gimel Amud Beis, Amar Rav Acha bar Chanina, Galui v'yadua lifnei misha amar v'haya ha'olam. It's obvious, basically, to the one who created the world, she'ein b'dora shel Rav Meir kamoso, that he was the absolute all-star of his generation. Okay, umipnalo kavo halacha kamoso. So, if we're extolling the virtues of Rav Meir and how brilliant he was, so one would think that we would tend to hold like him because he, after all, possessed the most talent and can figure out any situation. So why is it that we don't hold like him when it comes to halachic matters? The Gemara says, "Shelo yachlu chaverav la'amod al sof daito." Right, this is a knock on him. Right, this would be like the worst knock people have on us, is that he was so smart nobody really was able to understand him, right? Sometimes you have these people like you see today that are so brilliant that it's impossible to have a conversation with them because they're always going to one up you and they always end up right. And they're so smart. It's like, that song, don't let the wheels of your own don't let the sound of your own wheels drive you crazy, right? From the Eagles, right? That's what it reminds me of. Where you're so smart sometimes, but because nobody understands you, you're too deep, it ends up backfiring, and they just and you can't make an argument for him. So that was the problem of Rav Meir. And the Gemara gives an example. Shehu Omer al Tameh Tahor, right? Because he could say on something that's Tameh, it's really Tahor, Umar lo panim, right? Like the expression goes, I could convince you, right? Today is Friday, even though today is really Tuesday. But if you get someone who's so smart and convince you that today's Friday, then he can convince you anything, right? So that's what the problem was with Rav Meir. Whatever he touched, he dominated, right? And al tahar tamev al tameh tahur umar lo panim. He could prove anything and he could justify anything. Now that's Rav Meir. So if you look in the Gemara a few lines down, Amar Abivahu Amar Yochanan, Talmud Hayalol Rav Meir v'Sumchus Shmo. So who followed in Rav Meir's footsteps? Someone by the name of Sumchus. Shahaya Omer al Davar Davar. Shahaya Omer al Kol Davar v'Davar Shal Tuma Arba Mushmona Tame Tuma. V'al Kol Davar v'Davar Shal Tahara Arba Mushmona Tame Tahara. Again, we have another excellent debater by the name of Sumchus, right? He could take anything that was Tameh and he could give you 48 reasons why it's Tameh. And he could take something that's Tahor and he could give you 48 reasons, right? So basically, and this is, when you're like on a debating team, that's how they train you, right? They say, we're going to have a debate and we're not going to tell you which side to take. So you have to study each side and present your best case when the debate starts. So too over here, he could debate every single thing and give you reasons for this, reasons for pro, reasons for con, and that's why he was so good at what he did. Okay, and the specific example that the Gemara gives is that when it comes to tahara, he could tell you why it's tahar, and when it comes to tuma, he could tell you why it's tameh also. Okay, so the first question, by the way, on a side note, the Maharsha asked a good question. He says, "What's with the number 48?" Right? It's a very odd number. Well, it's an even number, obviously, but right? We don't really use that number 48 a lot. So the Maharsha says the reason how we get to 48 is because we know the Gemara in Nedarim says that there were 50 Sharei Bina, right? Whatever that means, there's 50 levels of Bina, of understanding. And the Gemara says, V'lo niglo l'Moshe rak memtes mehem. And Moshe was only able to get 49 of them. See, he was 2% missing. He only got a 98. Okay? So if Moshe was the highest at 49, the Maharsha says that one notch below 49 is 48. Okay, so that's right. You can't compare yourself to Moshe. Moshe can't compare himself to God. So therefore, we're down to the number 48. Okay, so that's a little bit of a background to understand this whole discussion of Sumchus and what he held and why he held. So now we're like, okay, so he really was 50-50. Because for each thing, he could tell you one way or the other way. So in the world of Sumchus, he was what we would call a median. He was right down the middle. right? He could go, right? He could fight for both sides. So that's why maybe the Rishonim in their explanation of why Sumchus holds the way he is when it comes to something in doubt, well, you don't know what to do, right? Split the baby, go right down the middle and offer something to one side and offer something to the other side, because that's exactly how Sumchus was coached from Rav Meir. Okay? So the Gemara says, now that we know a little bit about Sumchus, the problem with Sumchus, the Gemara says, is that Sumchus holds his rule that we split it without a Shavua. Okay? Our Mishnah, though, says that the two people do take a Shavua. So that's why the Gemara posits to say that the Mishnah cannot be Sumchus. Now, where do we know that Sumchus is of the opinion that whenever there's a doubt, okay, whenever there's a doubt, you split it without a Shavua? So for that, we have to remember the Gemara we learned a few months ago in Bava Kama. I'm reading from Bava Kama, Daf Mem Vav. It's the beginning of the fifth parak. Okay, here we have a classic Talmudic conundrum where the situation is you have one person who owns a shore and another person owns a para. Okay, and the Mishnah says, Shor shanaga chesa para, v'nimtza uvra b'tzida, v'le'en yadua imad shalod nagcha yalda, im yeshanagcha yalda. Okay, here's the situation. The shore gores the para. Okay, the para gets injured. The para happens to be pregnant. Okay, and the baby comes out. And when we come post-accident, all we see is that the shore, right, is on one side, the para is damaged, and the dead fetus of the para is on the floor. And you don't know if the para gave birth before, and if the para gave birth before the goring, then you can't hold the owner of the shore responsible because he didn't really damage the para, the vlad of the para, only the para itself. But if it happened after, meaning if the para got gored when she was pregnant, and as a result of the goring, the vlad came out, then that's a different story. Then the owner of the shore would be liable. So the problem is you don't have a video of what happened. So therefore, the Mishnah says, Mishalem chatzi nezek lepara v'ravi nezek levlad. What you do is, because we know that the para is a tam, you pay half of the damage to the para because you damaged the para. But when it comes to the baby, okay, we don't know what to do. I.e., we have a suffix in front of us. So if we knew what to do, you would pay half. So because we don't know what to do, the Mishnah says we split the chatzi nezek, and a half of a half becomes a quarter. Okay, that's the Mishnah. Famous Gemara starts off by saying, Amar v'Yehuda Amar Shmuel. Again, we're on Bava Kama Mem Vav Amar Aleph. Amar v'Yehuda Amar Shmuel, Zo divrei Sumchus. This Mishnah is exactly what Sumchus would typically hold. Why? Amar Maman Hamutot B'Safek Chokin. Because in this scenario, we don't know what time the blood came out. Was it before the goring or after the goring? So because we don't know, we are cholik, we split it. As opposed to which opinion? As opposed to the opinion of the Chachamim, of the Chachamim Omrim, Zeh Klal Gadol B'Din Hamotzi Mechaver of Haraya. Says the Chachamim, right, a line that we all know for hundreds of years, possession is 9/10 of the law, which basically means we go after chazaka, right? And in this case, if you want to collect money, okay, if the owner of the para wants to get extra money for the shore damaging, right, and killing the baby, then he has to prove it. So the money is in the pocket of the owner of the shore. If you want to take money out of the pocket, right, and make him pay you, then you have to prove it. So therefore, the Chachamim, the majority opinion, argue on Sumchus and say, no, we don't split literally the baby here, what we do is we go all or none. You're either going to prove that the shore, in fact, killed the baby, or if you can't prove it, then you are not going to get any money on account of the baby, just on account of the para. Okay? That is what the Chachamim say. And if you continue, the Gemara on Memvav Amud Beis has a very interesting line. The line is, how do we know? Okay, the Gemara goes back and forth a little bit, and the Gemara wants to know, this concept of motzi mechaver of haraya, which basically means you want something, you got to prove it, right? You want to sue somebody, you want to take money out of their possession because you claim that they wronged you. So the burden of proof is on the plaintiff. So where do we know this concept? The Gemara says, well, we have a pasuk. The pasuk says at the end of Mishpatim, Mi bal dvar mi yigash alehem. It's a pasuk when Moshe goes up to the Har Sinai and he appoints Yoshua, right, to be in charge. So whoever has an issue should go to Yoshua. The Gemara says, Mi bal dvar mi yigash alehem yagish raya alehem. So the Gemara takes it to mean, don't go to him. Bring your proof. If you have a claim, you have to bring a proof. So the Gemara asks a really, really interesting question. Maskeflo Ravashi, halamali kras varu. Ravashi says, I don't understand. Why do you need to tell me that there's a source? After all, isn't it a logical conclusion that anybody could think of? What's the logic? After all, if you have something that's bothering you, right, you go call the doctor. Meaning, person wakes up one morning with a toothache. Does that person expect the dentist to call him, or is that person going to call the dentist? So you're going to say, well, of course you're going to call the dentist. How does the dentist know to call you, right? The dentist doesn't want anything from you. You need something from the dentist. So the person who has the issue, he has to go seek his claim against the person who he wants something out of, right? Sounds very, very logical, right? So the Gemara says, you're right. Because it's logical, that pasuk that we quoted from Mishpatim, we're actually going to use for a completely different drasha. But the point of the Gemara is very, very deep. This Gemara says that svara, logic, okay, actually trumps, not that Trump, but dominates a pasuk in the Torah, which to us, we have to think about for a second, because we love sources, right? This whole class, I like to say that it's very important to know sources, where things come from, etc. The Gemara twice, it only appears twice in all of Shas. The Gemara over here is bothered with, why do I need a scriptural source when I have a logical source? Meaning, logic is actually a better proof than a pasuk, because a pasuk could be interpreted different ways. But when it comes to logic of the mind, if I have a logical conclusion, if something makes sense and is completely unassailable, you can't ask questions on it. For example, this proof over here. This proof over here says if you want something from someone, then you got to go and seek it out. How do you expect him to go seek you? You have to go seek him. There is no refuting that. So this actually is one of two places. Okay, just to give you a little illustration, there is one other place where the Gemara is also hell-bent on this concept of logic. Okay, here's the scenario. This is actually a Gemara in Ksuvos. Okay, it talks about the concept of Pesha Asar, Pesha Hitir. Okay, Gemara says, take this scenario for a second. Okay, you have two people that are walking down the road. One guy tells his friend, hey, you see that field over there on the right side? That field used to belong to your grandfather. But before you get too excited. He sold it to my grandfather, who then, after he died, gave it to my father, and it's going to be mine one day. Okay? And then the next day, this guy gets sent a letter, and he says, that field you told me yesterday was at one point my grandfather's, and therefore I want it back. So does that hold true? The Gemara says no. Because if what they call volunteer information that you didn't know, you can't use it against me in a court of law. Meaning the only reason why you're aware that this field used to be your grandfather's was because I told you. Had I shut up and not said anything, then you could have had a claim against me. But because I opened my mouth and then I backtrack and said, yes, it at once belonged to your family, now it belongs to my family, therefore I'm entitled to it. And the Gemara says that logic is so strong, there's no refuting it. Okay, so that's the second example. So this is what we call a svara. Now, sometimes there's something in the Gemara that it's called that's called a chiddush. Okay, for example, we had this in the middle of Bava Kama in the 7th perek, the concept of eight zomeim. Okay, and eight zomeim are two witnesses that come to court, and let's say two witnesses testify that Ruvain borrowed money from Shimon. Okay, borrowed $100 from Shimon and never paid it back. So the two witnesses come and say exactly what happened, and the judge says, okay, Ruvain, you have to give Shimon $100. 2 hours later, two other witnesses say, those two witnesses that came in an hour ago, they might be telling the truth, but they didn't witness it because they were with us 1,000 miles away, and there's no way that they could have seen what happened. So the Gemara says, well, who do we believe? So the Gemara in Meruba, in the 7th parak of Bava Kama, says what we have over here is a case where the second witnesses are believed. So the Gemara says, I don't get it. Why does the Torah give more probability that the second set are telling the truth as opposed to the first set? It's 50-50. Why do we believe the second pair over the first pair? Gemara says, you're right. We have no other reason except this is what we call a gzeras hakasuv. This is the law. That's one, but it's a chiddush because they could be equally righteous witnesses. But the Torah's chiddush is that this is how we act. Okay, we trust the second ones over the first ones. Another great example of a chiddush is, for example, the basar b'chala. Right, the Gemara in Chulin says, I don't understand. I have meat that's 100% kosher by itself. I have cheese that's 100% kosher by itself. So they're both good. All of a sudden, I put them together in a cheeseburger where the meat is kosher and the cheese is kosher, so you should be home free. But the Torah says no. When you put them together, their mixture causes an isser, causes something forbidden. Why should that be? So the Gemara says it's a chiddush. Okay, we don't understand why. Now you're going to say, well, isn't every mitzvah a chiddush? How about kilayim? How about what's wrong with going on an elevator on Shabbos? Is that work? So you could ask 1,000 questions, and the Gemara, Tosas actually in Yevamos answers that question and says that the term chiddush it's all relative, meaning it's all within the framework of halacha. Yes, there are some things that are obvious once you learn the halachas, but this is something that's outside the bounds. Okay, so, or else we have a problem that everything is really a chiddush. But when it comes to the witnesses, for example, believing the second pair over the first pair doesn't really make much sense, right? So therefore, that's called a chiddush. So getting back to our topic, we have a svara of motzi mechavel of haraya, okay? And according to the Chachamim, that motzi mechavel of haraya is what we implore when we have a doubt. So getting back to our Mishnah in Bava Kama, when you have the shor and when you have the para, right? When you have the shor and when you have the para, Sumcha says that you split it, okay? And the Chachamim say you never split it. What you do is you say, either you prove to me that you gored after, right? And therefore the baby you're now responsible for because you gored the baby to death. And if you can't prove that, then there's no way that you're going to get money from the owner of the shore. So there's a short comment that the Shitu Mekubetzes in Bava Kama makes. When the Gemara asks the question, why do we need a pasuk, right? For Motzi Michel Vel Paraya, isn't it a svara? What the Gemara is really asking, says the Shitu Mekubetzes, Klomar, Ubaha afilu sumchos mode. So what's bothering the Gemara? Not that why do we need a pasuk? Isn't it a logical conclusion that anybody could make up? No. What the Gemara really is bothered by is if it's so obvious, wouldn't Sumcha sometimes agree to Motzi Mecharel Havaraya? And why do they argue? And why do Sumchas argue on the Rabbanon? It must be that it's possible in some cases that Sumchas actually agrees with the Rabbanon. And I think the Shitu Mekubetzes with this one line opens up the whole discussion that we're going to talk about soon as to, does Sumchas always disagree and say that we split everything? Or are there some cases where Sumchas would actually agree? Okay? So in order to develop this a little bit more, we need to see other cases that involve doubts. Okay, we have the case in Shnai and Ochsen, where two people are in doubt as to the ownership of the talis. We just saw Bava Kama, okay, where two people are arguing about this Vlad, right, this fetus of the para that was born. Are you going to get paid for it? Then there's an interesting case in Yevamos. Okay, the story in Yevamos is as follows. I'm reading from Yevamos, Daf Lamed Zayin. The Gemara says, Safek v'yavam shaba'u lachlo b'nichse misna. Okay, here we have a case of a yavam. Okay, so a woman does yibum. Okay, very nice. The problem is she did yibum too early. Okay, we learned, if you remember, you have to wait a few months, because if you don't wait 3 months, then you may do yibum too quickly and you may get pregnant. And before the days of 23andMe, you weren't going to know for sure who the father was, right? Because the father could have been the dead brother, right? And then you have a baby boy, okay? So the boy that's born doesn't know who his father was or is. It could be the new man, okay? And it could have been a preemie, right? Or, right, because he was born after 7 months, or maybe he was really born 9 months, but she got pregnant 2 months before she did Yibum. And it's really a bentes, a 9-month-old baby, okay? Or a 9-month pregnancy. So this kid has a problem now. He doesn't know who his father is. So obviously there's many halachic problems with that. One of them is going to be, he's going to have a debate or a dispute with his dead father's brother now, because now it comes to splitting up the estate. Okay, and you could see over here what's going to happen. So who gets first dibs on the estate? So the Gemara says, Safek Amar Anabar Misnu. He says, listen, my father is the one who died, right? V'nichse didininu. And the property is all mine. I inherit my father before you, my uncle. Okay, so that's what this baby suffix says. The Yavam Amar, and the brother-in-law, i.e., the brother, right, who did Yibum, says, "What are you talking about? You're my son. At brai didiat, you are my son. V'leislach v'lo midi benachsai." And therefore, my brother died. That's my brother. I'm first in line before you because you're my son. So here we have a big duel. So how does the Gemara resolve this? The Gemara says, "Have maman hamutal b'safek u'maman hamutal b'safek cholkin." Ah, I have an answer, right? We go back to what Sumcha says. Okay, so here we have a great argument. Now, this is a case where no one's ever going to know. Okay, and that's very important to understand now, because as we see these different cases of doubts, this is a case, obviously, before genetic testing. So they could argue till kingdom come, but nobody will ever know the truth. And Tosfos, on this Gemara, on Daf Lamed Zayin in Yevamos, says as follows. Because the Gemara says we split it, and the Gemara doesn't say this is according to Sumchus. Remember, like we had in Bava Kama? This mission is according to Sumchus, but the Rabbanan argue. Tosfos points out that because nobody argues here, afilu Rabbanan de Sumchus moda hachadolo shayach kana motzi mechaver al haraya. Here, we're not going to say, hey, if you want the estate, you got to prove it. She'ein zeh muchsak yoter mizeh. Because one of them doesn't have the advantage over the other one. They are equal 50-50. They each have the same probability, right, of being first in line. We have no idea who the father is. So it's a 50-50. One doesn't have an advantage over the other. And Tosfos compares it to V'havei kamo halalu ba'in liyaresh v'halalu ba'in liyaresh. Compares it to a case another case we're going to see, which is very comparable to this in Bava Basra. What is that case? So here you have a tragic case, but it's tragic, but because it's in Bava Basra, we're not interested in the tragedy per se. We're interested in the halachic ramifications. So let's open up Bava Basra to page 158. All right, let's go Bava Basra, Huf Nun Ches Amud Beis. Okay, the end of Bava Basra talks about how to split up contested inheritances. Okay, so the Mishnah says, turn to it. The Mishnah says as following, Kuf Nun Ches 158a. Okay, ready for this case? Nafal habayis alav va'alishto. You have a man and a woman living peacefully at home. One day, their house blew up. Okay, so obviously it's a tragedy, and obviously you have to worry about the burial and all that. But we're talking about monetary cases over here. So while some people are worried about sitting shiva, other worried are about who gets the money. Okay. So who gets the money? What do you mean who gets the money? Well, you have a husband and a wife, and the Mishnah says, Yorshei habal omrim isha mesa risha. V'achar kach mesa habal. Okay, you see what's going on over here? The people, there are family members on each side. Okay, so the man had his money, and his wife had her own money. Let's just say, so the people who inherit the husband, okay, say, you know what really happened? The wife died first, and then the husband died, and therefore what? So therefore, for 2 minutes, while the husband was alive still, he inherited the wife's money, and now the husband died. So therefore, let's say the husband's brother pops up, or the husband's father, okay, comes and says, I get everything now. I get what my son had who died. And because he, for 2 minutes, outlived his poor wife, he is now entitled to what she has. And therefore, he gets everything. And the inheritors of the wife get zilch. Yorshe Isha Omrim, guess what the inheritors of the wife say? Au contraire, Baal Meis Rishon, Vachakach Mesa Isha. Ah, so here you have a Mexican standoff. We have no idea what the truth is. All we know is that there's a fight. Okay, there's a Yerusha fight. Not the first, and probably not the last. So how do we deal with it? Beis Shammai Omrim Yachloku. Beis Shammai says, split the baby. Okay, divide everything 50-50. Ubeis Hillel Omrim Nechasin Bechezkasan. Beis Hillel complicates, and they say that the Nechasim, the property. Now, what's interesting over here is that you're going to say to yourself, I thought whatever the husband or whatever the woman owned, doesn't really the husband dominate the woman? So therefore, whatever the woman has, the man technically owns. So the truth is that we're talking about over here the property that the wife brought with her into the marriage, right? That goes back to her in case of a divorce or death. So therefore, what Beis Hillel says is that the property that the wife brought in, okay, goes status quo, okay? Ksuva becheskes yorshe habal, the ksuva, right? The amount of the money in the ksuva stays in the possession of the husband, okay? Because after all, the ksuva is collected from the husband's property. If he doesn't have cash, it goes from the husband's property. But nechasim hanichnasim v'hayotzin becheskes yorshe ha'av. But the property that is traded in his lifetime, okay, i.e., what we call the peiros, that the husband plucks from the property that comes from the woman during her marriage, that becheskes yorshe ha'av, that stays in the possession of the wife's father, because that's where it started. So Beis Hillel say we leave everything what we call status quo, where it was left at last sight. Okay, status quo. But the Gemara says, according to Beis Hillel, becheskas mi, who actually ends up with it, right? Meaning, according to Beis Hillel, the property that the wife brought into the marriage, okay, stays in its previous ownership. But the Gemara wants to know over here, in whose possession does the property that's guaranteed stay in? So if Yochanan says b'cheskes yarshe habal, or Beleza omer b'cheskes yarshe ha'isha, okay, there's a machlokes. But here's what's important for us, and this is what Tosfos in Yevamos Lamed Zayin said. Rab Shimon ben Lakish mishum bar kapara, Reish Lakish says yachloku. V'chen tani bar kapara hol v'halalu ban liyarish v'halalu ban liyarish yachloku. Right? Reish Lakish says no. Since these come to inherit and those come to inherit, neither can prove his correct claim. So what they do is they divide everything, split 50-50 down the line. So now let's get back to our Gemara in Bava Metzia. We have seen several cases of disputes. So the Gemara wants to know over here, in our case, is our Mishnah Sumchus? So the Gemara says it's not Sumchus. But could it really be Sumchus? Meaning, does Sumchus say, ever Hamotzi Mechavel of Haraya? Meaning, will he ever, and this is what the Tosas in Bava Kama, that's what the Shita Mekubetzis alluded to, that it may be true that there are several cases where Sumchus, right, who usually deny Motzi Mechavel of Haraya, they may qualify it based on the situation. So Tosfos, if you go to Daf Beis Amud Beis, actually says that, because Tosfos makes a distinction between Shnayim Ochsen Betalis and the case of Shorsha Nagach Es Hapara. What is the difference? The Tosfos says, it's the third to last Tosfos in Daf Beis Amud Beis. Tosfos basically says Sumchus might agree when there's no Drara de Mamona. Drara de Mamona, the way Tosfos believes, is something called a scientific suffix. Meaning, What's the difference between two people walking into Besdin with a contested article versus we don't know if the animal, if the fetus was gored, right? Or if it just came out before. The difference is when it comes to the Shorsha Nagach Esapara, that's a case where, to quote Tosfos, Safek below Tanoseyan. Meaning, when Besdin comes to the scene of the crime and sees the shor, and sees the injured para, and sees the dead fetus, and then Reuven and Shimon are there, Reuven and Shimon don't have to open up their mouths at all because we already know what their taina is. There could be one and only one claim. Reuven says that, right, that Shimon's shor is responsible for the fetus's death, and Shimon says the opposite. There's no other way of explanation. So it's almost like they're neutered. They have no claim because Besdin already can predict what they're going to say. As opposed to two people that walk into courts holding a talis, there could be 1,000 different claims. One could say, my mother made me this talis, and the person could say, well, she's my mother and she made me the talis. And the other person could say, well, I found it and this guy found it. There are so many. One person could say, I bought it first. And the other brother could say, well, I ordered it first. There are so many possible claims when two people are grasping something that creates a objective claim. That creates an objective doubt. And Besdin therefore has to decide, let's listen to each of their claims and let's judge based off of that. So maybe over there, Sumchus would say, you know what? You want it, you got to prove it. Hamotzi mechaver of haraya. But in the case of the Shorsha Nagach Esapara, we have absolutely no idea. There's no video, there's no way of knowing what really happened. So therefore, maybe only there, and this is the way most Rishonim learn. I saw interesting online. There was a Rav Moshe Tarragon from Gush had a whole discussion about how we view. I'm just going to read a little bit of it. He said, he says that he quotes our Tosfos, and he says that Sumchus only imposes Yachloku. Okay, the way he says it is a distribution in a situation of an objective suffix, which basically means an absolute dispute that emerges independent of the respective claims of the litigants, right? For example, like we just said a minute ago, Sumchus would apply Yachloku regarding the Shorsha Nagach Esapara, right? Because in this instance, all you have to do is split it. He suspends the Cheskas Mamon and chooses a Yachloku. Cheskas Mamon is, right, whose possession is it last left in? So therefore, Sumchus says, we don't need to do that, right? We have this dispute, what he calls an absolute dispute, as opposed to a case of Shnai Nochs in the Talis, where it really depends on what their, right? He calls it a birur, right? Which is the yeshivish or the right. This is very right when this topic is learned in yeshiva. So basically, it comes down to something called a birur. A birur, the way it's explained, it's because it's possible that Sumchus agrees with the general doctrine of chazaka. Again, remember what Tosfos said in Bava Kama? It's very hard to dispute the logic of Hamotzi Mechavel of Haraya. But here, Sumchus defines it as a legal procedure, meaning it's not proof, right? Me holding something or something that's in my possession, does that prove that I own it? That's the debate, right? If I go into your house and in your car and in your driveway, I see a car, and in your house, I see a piano and a couch and furniture and appliances. So the philosophical question is, does the fact that this is all on your property prove that you own it? Well, you're going to say, well, of course it does. How else could I own something, right? What else is it? It's all over my property. So this is almost like a circular discussion. Do I own it, right? Meaning, because I own it, is that proof that it's mine, or is it mine because I own it? Right? It's one of those arguments, but that's really the point that Tosis is making over here, is that don't think that Sumchus says what he says all the time, right? And the truth is, the Gemara itself in Bava Metzia on Daf Kuf, where the Gemara over there talks about a Mishnah very similar to Shoshanaga Chesapara, where you have someone who buys a para by switching it with a chamor, and the para gives birth, and an hour later, when you come to pick it up, you see the baby, and you don't know if the baby was born before the sale, and therefore the baby is not included in the sale, or was the baby born after the sale. So over there, Rav is of the opinion that Sumchus only says Yachloku if the two people don't have firm claims, or what we call, they're not bari, they're only Shema. In these situations, if it's only Shema, so then Bezdin can say, well, whose possession was it last left in? So even over there, there's a discussion about, well, does Sumcha say it only when two of them don't know? But what if they are absolute sure? Then would he change his mind? So that's a whole other discussion. But I just wanted to bring this up because I think it's interesting that, we had this a few days ago in the daf, and it's very important to analyze. Now, the irony is that we don't hold like Sumchus. So all of this is a moot point, or as we like to say, it's all academic. But I just thought that it's interesting to know. I wanted to talk about one other comment that the Gemara makes. The Gemara has a discussion on Daf Dalid regarding Rav Chia. Okay, we talk a lot about Moda b'miktsas. Moda b'miktsas is if I have a claim against me and I agree to half of it. Okay, so the Torah says that because I agree to half of it, okay, I have to take a shvua on the rest that I don't owe you. Again, a person says you owe me $100. I say it was only $50, and you give it to him, so you have to swear on the other $50. So the Gemara actually brings that up and says that in the view of Rav Chia, it's not only if I admit to it and establish that I owe it to you. What if Adam establish that I owe it? Because I say I owe you nothing. And Adam and witnesses come and say, no. You actually do owe 50. And they nail him. And he's like, oh yeah, you're right. But I don't owe you the second 50. So there Rav Chia also says that the Moed Miktsas applies. And the Gemara goes into the whole reasoning of Moed Miktsas. And I want to say a little bit about it, because it's a very profound concept, I think. On the bottom of Gimel Amud Aleph, the Gemara says, the Amar Rabba, Amar Torah Moed Miktsas Atayna Yishava. Rabba wants to understand something. Now, what he wants to understand is actually a debate between Rashi and Tosfos. The way Tosfos learns the Gemara, Tosfos says, what's bothering Rabba? Rabba says, why does the Torah want to make a Moed B'miktsas swear? After all what? Tosfos says, after all, if this guy really wanted to lie, he would have said, you know what? I owe you nothing. I owe you nothing, and the rule is, and there's a discussion why this rule applies, but the rule is that if somebody is kofer hakol, if somebody says, I don't owe you anything, I don't know who you are, if someone is kofer hakol, we say that you don't have to swear at all. So this person says to himself, I could have been out of a shvua, I could not take a shvua at all. Why am I being such a nice guy and admitting to half of it? I could have denied the whole claim. So that's why Tosfos says Rabba's psychology. So let's continue. So Rabbah says, you know why you have to take a shvua? Because chazaka ein adamei panav b'pnei balchov. Very interesting line. Okay, back then, a long, long time ago, before today's culture, people actually used to respect people that would help them out. And the Gemara says it's a near certainty that if someone were to lend you money and ask for it a month later, you wouldn't deny that creditor that you borrowed money. Now, believe it or not, it's actually a machlokas, Rashi Tosfos, what the reason is. So Rashi, we learned in Bava Kama, and Daf Kuf Zayin at the end of Masechet Bava Kama a few weeks ago, is of the opinion that someone who did a tova for you, right? You need to be bailed out. You needed $1,000. You needed to be bailed out. So Rashi says, could you imagine a guy bails you out, gives you $1,000, and then comes to you 2 weeks later, and you completely deny that he lent you the money? I mean, you have to be crazy, right? So it can't happen. Tosfos says, no. It has nothing to do with the fact that he did you a favor. It has to do with the fact that he knows the truth. If you are approached by someone who knows exactly whether you're lying or not, chances are you wouldn't lie to him. So park that, because that itself is, there's a lot to talk about on, as you could imagine, just on that line. But getting back to Rabbah says, you know what the psychology is? Why it is that a person has to take a shvua? Because a person, when approached, their first tendency would be, you know what, let me deny everything. But it's almost like the good demon and the bad demon, right? The Yetzer Tov and the Yetzer Hara. The Yetzer Hara is telling him, deny everything, right? But I can't deny it all, as we say, the Gemara says on the bottom, Mishum de'en adamei is panav. Because a person wouldn't have the chutzpah, let's learn at least according to Rashi, in Bava Kama, you wouldn't have the chutzpah to tell someone who bailed you out 2 weeks ago, hey, I have no idea who you are, you never lent me money. Good. So that's one side of him. So when the pendulum swings to the other side, so because he doesn't have the chutzpah, he should be a tzaddik and say, you know what? You're right. I owe you everything you're asking. And the Gemara says he should agree to everything. So why isn't he admitting to everything? Why is he saying that I only owe you $50, not $100? He's doing what we all say. The expression is he's kicking the can down the road. He's procrastinating. He's saying into himself, you know what? I have some of the money. I don't have all of it. Chances are, if I work for the next couple of weeks, if I ask around, I'll figure out how to get the money. But right now, today, when I'm being approached, I don't have it. So therefore, Savar, I'll wait, right? I'll wait till my stock trade settle. I'll wait till my CD matures. Then I'll give it to him. So therefore, the Torah knows exactly human behavior. The Amar Rachmana, Rami Shvua Aleha, you know what? We're going to teach this guy a lesson. We're going to make him swear. So he admits to everything. And if he really, really is telling the truth, then he's not going to swear falsely. So he'll pay the 50 and he'll swear on the other 50. So I think this is a fascinating psychological insight as to how people operate. I just want to, there's a couple of things I wanted to say on it, that one of them is the whole assumption of this Gemara is that he could have been, at least the way Tosfos learns, is that he could have been believed. Again, the way this starts off by saying, why does the Torah say to swear? After all, he could have said to himself, I'm better off denying the whole thing. But the truth is, why does the Torah not mandate a shvua, an oath for someone who denies the whole thing? You could say to yourself, if you have to take a shvua on half, you should probably take a shvua on everything. So we don't have enough time to discuss it, but there are a couple of reasons that the Gemara, I'm sorry, that the Rishonim discussed. There's a Ramban. Um, the Ramban says, She'im kofer hakol hayachayev. The Ramban says he learns it, we'll do the Ritva. The Ritva says, Shadaf gamodu mixas chayev mishum sheyesh raglayim ladava. You know why the Ritva says? Because, again, there's a psychological concept over here that if a person admits to you partially, then chances are the whole thing is true. Exactly like the Gemara says. If you deny it, then okay, maybe it's not true. But if you're already giving in a little bit, the Ritva says chances are that there's some truth to what you're saying. I saw an interesting, we always like to bring in psychology today. So, every time we learn this Gemara, I think about this concept of ishtamute kamishtamit, which basically means we all love to procrastinate. Meaning, yeah, we'll pay it when we have time, but not yet. Like, come on, who pays their bills on time, right? And it's actually a discussion elsewhere in Bava Basra. We're going to see that if a person lends you money for 30 days, let's say, and he comes to you at the end of 30 days and says, where's the money? And you say, I paid back before it's due, it's actually a machlokas whether you're believed or not. Because there's a machlokas whether people pay back, or today's day and age, pay bills before they're due. One opinion is that it doesn't happen, right? So we have this concept that people love to, that people love to push off things. In fact, I was looking, this is an article I saw, The Psychology of Procrastination. So I read this, one of these therapists, what they call today, they want to know the causes of procrastination. And examining the causes of procrastination, arguably the biggest driver of procrastination is a concept called discomfort intolerance. Anybody hear of that? Discomfort intolerance is a commonly held attitude that an unpleasant activity or experience is too complicated or unbearable, says Julia Baum, LMHC, a therapist practicing in New York. It contributes to feeling anxious about the task at hand and leads to a tendency to avoid that task. Okay, great. I mean, we all know this. This is not a chiddush, but again, I find it, always inspiring when we see this concept and it's rooted in a Gemara that talks about the psychology of behavior, right? About how people behave and why they do things the way they do, to the point where it comes into play in Bava Metzia, where Rabbah says that's exactly the reason why we're going to make this person swear. Because if it's true, he's going to tell the truth, right? Again, those were the days when people didn't, swear falsely, and that a word was a word. And we want you to admit to everything. So if you really owe that money and you're just pushing it off, then you're lying. You can't do that. So you have to counteract that, that Yetzer Hara and, be moda and admit to the truth. So I thought that was a little, interesting ending. And I hope you learned something. All right. Question?